Okay, I think we start. So welcome everybody, and a big welcome to our panelists, Edmund Clark, Susanne von Falkenhausen, Martha Rosler, and today's moderator, Steffen Siegel. Thank you all for taking the time and joining us. For the start, just allow me a few technical notes. You might already have noticed that we disabled the audio and video for the participants. But of course, you are all welcome to interact. So please post your questions and comments in the chat box. And please feel free to write in there right from the start. We try to curate all your questions and include them into the discussion later. Yeah, thank you all for coming. Today, we will talk about how to make images matter. The search for new narrative forms in the field of photojournalism and documentary were our starting point in 2017 when we created Image Matters, a platform for discussion about issues in photographic practice, discourse in the theory of images and photography, as well as in visual and cultural studies. For the ones who might not know who is behind this we, I would just very briefly like to introduce the Image Matters team. As a part of the photojournalism and documentary photography program at Hannover's University of Applied Sciences and Arts. Sophia Greif, Anna Stemmler, and Malte Radke. Sophia, Anna, and Malte, you see them in the video. Thank you for everything. It's really wonderful working with you. And I really cannot stress this enough. So far, with the Image Matters team, we edited 2 volumes, Images in Conflict in 2018. And now this year, Image Context, Documentary Practices Between Journalism, Art, and Activism. With our new book, you can see here parts of it, we try to delve further into the possibilities of the documentary, to subvert its traditional viewing habits, expectations, and stereotyping. We found out that there's a strong tendency of recent documentary strategies to burst the bubble of photographic illusionism. In doing so, we found out current projects draw out the context dependency of meaning by combining and confronting different descriptive systems. When we started our research on the project, artists like Martha Rosler and Alan Sekula played a very important role for us. So I'm absolutely delighted that for today's discussion, we have Martha Rosler with us. Thank you, Martha, for joining us. Martha Rosler has undertaken exhaustive exploration of the critical potential of documentary narrations since the early 1970s. Calling for a critical reorientation of its practices. She was always concerned with repoliticizing the institutional and discursive strategies of the documentary. In her work, The Bowery in Two Inadequate Descriptive Systems, which you can see here, and which she created already in 1974 to 1975, Rosler reflects in depth on the relationship between image and text, and the possibilities of transporting reality attributed to them. The question of representation itself is already raised in the work's title. A strong tendency to push beyond the purely visual narrative is also apparent in Edmund Clark's work. Hello, Ed. Thank you for being with us. In the collaborative book, Negative Publicity, Artifacts of Extraordinary Rendition, documents researched by the journalist Croft and Black interact with Edmund Clark's photographs. Negative publicity gives a prominent example how to seek innovation in documentary practice by situating visual narratives in the context of intersecting discourses. Ed not only contributed to Image Context, the new book, but also to the first volume, Images in Conflict, and the accompanying exhibition. We also have a picture of the exhibition where you might get an inspiration how it looked like. In his conversation with Sophia, which is part of the new book, Ed says, "The traditional model of the photojournalist going out into the world, taking photographs that are reproduced in magazines, usually with someone else's text, and this is how you understand the world, this model has been superseded." Clark sees a way out in creative approaches that undermine repetitive forms of representation to foster criticism, reconsideration, and reflection. Certain forms of documentary production shift and blur not only the limits of the media, but also those of the discourses of documentary, art, and activism. And this brings me to our next guest, Susanne von Falkenhausen. Susanne is a professor of modern art history at the Institute of Art and Visual Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. In her essay in the book about the localization of the documentary in form, content, and dissemination, and the term's usefulness as a category, she investigates the video works of Angela Militopoulos. Falkenhausen notes, with the boundaries between art and documentary being crossed, mostly by artists and curators, less by the practitioners of documentary as genre, it might be worth looking at developments in this sphere. In both of our books, Fredrickson had the last words. In Images in Conflict, he wrote, "It's an exciting time." In Image Context, he ended with, "Much work is required." Therefore, I'm very much looking forward to our discussion today. And with that, I would like to hand over to our moderator, Steffen Siegel. Steffen has been a professor for the theory and history of photography at Wolfgang University of the Arts in Essen since 2015. At Folkwang, he is directing the master program, Photography Studies and Research, and the doctoral studies on theory and history of photography. Steffen, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Karen, for the introduction and, of course, for the invitation to host this, this little discussion tonight. I hope you all will understand me very well. And it's a pleasure and it's an honor to speak to three very different, but then most interesting colleagues and in two cases, artists who hopefully have to contribute a lot to our current understanding what the documentary might be in the 21st century. Please allow me very short remarks before we go into our discussion, and I'd like to take it, because this is the reason why we are here, I'd like to take it from this book, Image Context, which was edited by the team that is hosting us here tonight. And I'd like to start with just 5 words, which I took from an interview Sophia Greif, part of the team I just mentioned, did with Laia Avril. Most of you will know Laia's artistic work. She just said, we need to face things. And of course, we could relate it, for instance, to her.
Ja, Uta, hallo. Na, wie geht's dir? Wo bist du?
I hear something that I shouldn't hear, maybe. Is this other technical problems? No. So I can just go back to my remarks. So we need to face things. And we could relate it to her book on abortion, for instance. But at the same time, we can relate it and go back to works Karin in her introduction just mentioned. For instance, Martha Rosler's Bringing the War Home, or Body Beautiful, or Body Knows No Pain, or The Bowery into Inadequate Descriptive Systems. We need to face things, might be something like an overarching thesis for or argument for what the documentary is all about. And I don't have in mind even more classic examples such as let's say Jacob Riis or Louis Hine or Walker Evans or August Sander or whoever, but maybe more straightforward photo montage such as Martha Rosler's, or tableaus combining black and white photography and typed text, as we have just seen it in the Bowery work by Martha. I think the interesting and even today very challenging argument behind these works is that it is not just a grammar of photographic expression and meaning, but it is a grammar of doubt, of skepticism, or as Martha Rosler put it in her very well-known remarks, a refusal. And I think it is not necessary, but yet I want to remind us that this kind of work was developed very much at the same time as the post-structural movement and deconstruction started to develop in France. From my point of view, both the documentary movement from a more modernist point of view on the one hand, and let's say post-structuralists in France on the other, dealt with different means, of course, but they revolved around the same problems. And I think this relates us to a dictionary of very noble philosophical concepts, but concepts that turn out to be very questionable at the same time. They are iffy, they are problematic when we put them into the realm of mass media and mass communication. My list is incomplete, but in this list might be something like truth, veracity, authenticity, reality, trust, and so on. And yes, we in our own writing nowadays may not bow in all our texts to these theorists such as Foucault or Christophe or Barthes or Derrida or whoever, but I think it is fair to state that their impact is current in our is present in our current discourses. And the very same we can state for texts by Rosalind Krauss, more related to photography now, or Abigail Solomon Godot, or Alan Sekula, or of course, Martha Rosler. I think it is remarkable that at least some of those writers I just mentioned were and are practicing artists, not just theorists, but practicing artists. And I think it is not by chance that the documentary sits in the center of all these questions, all these discussions from the 1970s and 80s. Just because the documentary represents and challenges key concepts, key problems of the photographic in general. And when we now start a discussion on what documentary style, documentary strategies, documentary art could be nowadays, I think in terms of objectives, strategies, styles, it is much more than a debate with limited interests. I think it is all about how we, and this is what the book we discussed tonight is about, how we gather information? How do we experience the world? And finally, how do we create knowledge? Edmund Clark's work in particular is, I think, very much related to this kind of questions I just mentioned. For instance, Guantanamo or letters to Omar. I started my very short intro with Abril's "We need to face things." And I'd like to remind us that we are now refrained a little bit to what is interesting in terms of photography. We face two problems here. The first is that documentary is much more than photography. It's a very broad term that can be related to so many different artistic and non-artistic productions. This is the first problem. And the second one is it's a shifting one. When it came into the discourse about 100 years ago, it meant something, and then it underwent a lot of developments. And my question to the three participants of our panel would be, we just heard old news might be something like from the 70s, 80s. I'm not so sure about that, but what could be the new news about documentary practices? What is, and this is the question for Martha, Edmund, and Susanne, what is interesting for you when it comes to current contemporary practices in the field of art, journalism, and activism? This is the three terms of the undertitle of the book nowadays. Maybe I have to install something like a speaking order, just because we are trying to interact now. Maybe it's first Martha, then Edmund, then Susanne von Falkenhausen.
I really don't know where to pitch my answer. You're asking what's interesting. Well, the question is, anything that interests is interesting. And I include even traditional documentary. Of course, as your book is at pains to point out, every element of meaning is defined by its contextualization. And so the way that images and texts are embedded in experience and in other forms is critical to their reception and also to their understanding by viewers, especially if they are today, though this has been going on for decades, are rooted in the experience of the participants pictured. Let's say that there are individuals involved in questions, though of course not all documentary is about groups of people, but it certainly is always about the way people inhabit various places or are affected by it. And obviously we've moved away from the authorial control of the photographer. The question is how far and how deeply that gets us into questions of witness testimony and authenticity. Again, these are very old questions, but they seriously affect the reception of work these days. You can have all the objective texts you want accompanying images, but if there's no immediate appeal to experience and affect, and even, dare I say it, empathic or solidarity or usness, the work will not appeal. I noticed recently an attempt to put together a list of the most important videos of the, since video began. And what struck me about them was that the works were selected, first of all, by their embeddedness in the art world, and second, by their politicized edge to a neo-formalist reconstitution of the image. So I would say that that's a negative attempt to, a fairly negative though, predictable in terms of professional situations, attempt to recapture the definition of a mode in order to reclaim it as different from the usual flow of images out in the big world. But I think actually the real story is that exactly that flow of images in the big world, and particularly as how it affects people's relationship to activism on the one hand and ideological confirmation on the other. I don't know if what I'm saying makes any sense, but it's certainly not new. Photography has been demoted as a modernist form, even though I would say, in my opinion, in Germany especially, there's an effort to continually reclaim it for art historical concerns. Excuse me. But the fact is that photography and documentary images that appear to be closest to affect and experience are ones that galvanize movements and transmit meaning across linguistic and cultural boundaries. Those are words, but I'm sure you know what I'm saying, and it's a recognizable phenomenon that when we have objects of study, we tend to try and tease out of them characteristics that may not accord with how they are received on the ground. But I would never claim that that's irrelevant or illicit or a failure of ideas. It's important to engage in, for example, iconographic analysis and also to trace out modes of transmission. But the fact is that the photograph no longer exists as a cultural object that is separate. And of course it never has. But we have pretty much had to give up on looking at photography as something apart from the way we see it. And again, I'm just repeating your own thesis, and I don't know that I've added anything to this conversation. So we could move on, or you could question further.
Yeah, I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are when it comes to your remarks. Thank you, Martha. Something I thought, which is kind of striking, is that the theory of photography is dealing with a certain set of questions and problems that are pretty much as old as the medium is, let's say roughly 200 years old. And at some point, we don't get rid of those problems and questions. Although we witness in a remarkable way nowadays, let's say the last 20 years or so, in remarkable ways, technological developments that we could not really imagine 20 years ago. And I'm sure we will discuss this when we look at specific works we can see in this book we discuss here, and we go on with our discussion. But before we do this, I'd like to go back to Edmund and Susanne.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, I think there's three things which strike me. You asked me what do I think is interesting. In terms of what I look at, what interests me is things that I can't see, things that photography can't show. I think my own work, a lot of that is about silence and absence and often redaction. And I think that's where photography is interesting. It's when you're using the camera as a documentary tool, and you're using the technology of seeing to try and represent things that are not being seen, that are being silenced, or that are being represented in a way which is problematic. It's using documentary praxis to try and see differently, to try and re-represent, to try and recontextualize. I think those are practices, those are elements of documentary which I think are interesting. And secondly, I think, and this is in some ways scary or worrying, but I think there is no truth that we are trying to represent. There are so many different truths. There are each different audience, each different segment, each different subscriber to a different platform can have a completely different truth. And that is, as I say, on the one hand, worrying, but at the same time, it's also incredibly interesting if you are trying to make work around what is happening in the world today, because there is a richness to what you can do with images now, which I think has come out of the multiplicity of imagery which surrounds us, the multiplicity of truth. There are narratives which can be complex, which can be layered, which I think is interesting, and it can go in so many different ways. It can be used in ways which are politically very powerful, politically very empowering, politically very important, but it can also be manipulated in ways which are incredibly propagandistic and dangerous. And that kind of leads me on to my third element, which I think is interesting, which is we live now, I mean, almost every society we live in has an extraordinary cultural divide in it. There are culture wars going on in Britain, in America, all over the world, where there's a division. And I think people who are making visual work now, I think there is a nuance between what is political, what is activist, what is resistance, what is identifiable. I think there is a tension for people making political work now, which if it is, there's a risk that we end up shouting at our own supporters, which is a facet of this the culture wars in every country. I think trying to make work which is not so overtly activist that it becomes neutered by its very message, trying to make work which has the ability to engage people across the cultural divide from each side of this cultural conflict, and to sustain itself for all those audiences, I think is a real challenge. And I think that's what I find. Work that is trying to do that, I find very interesting. Work that is too overtly political and activist, I find often quite redundant, because the moment you identify yourself as an act of resistance, you cease to be effective, because you will be dismissed by the people who you actually need to communicate with and convince. So those are kind of three elements of what's going on, I think, in terms of the contemporary world and documentary practice, which I think are certainly interesting for me.
Comment?
Yeah.
You want me to go on? You want to comment?
Yeah, please.
Well, my interests are not the interests of an active artist. I'm the one looking from outside in a ways, but I'm also very implicated in the political questions concerning the photographical image, but not as a photographical image. It's much more. Well, one thing which occurred to me when I thought about the concept underlying the book is that there must be a problem about the location of context. Context normally is ascribed as the surrounding of an object. So an object of art or photography as an object has a context, but the book is about integrating context in the actual photographic and documentary work. That's a totally different procedure, and I think it is coming out of the multiplication of stages where you deal with images, where you communicate, where you deal with politics and with activism. And I am interested in where art, I'm looking from the side of art, gets into the documentary. One main point is this not so new anymore way of doing art, which is called artistic research, which is opening the object into something that is not contextualizing, it's including the context. It tries to find a way to channel the conflict, the context into something that is operable under the point of view of art. And the other thing is that photography, I can't see it isolated as photography. I can only see it including video, selfies, and whatever, and our screen, which we are looking at right now as well. And as one of the and the multiple stages that coincide right now, or that are the stages where you are dealing with identity politics and also with things that I am really very worried about, which is the elimination of images. That is censorship and deplatforming, as they seem to call it in the US right now, which is a very hypocritical way of naming something that is censorship. And I'm against this, but that's another field. But that's where my interests in dealing with photography, which is mostly concerned with people, by the way, and there's lots of other photography too. For example, Martha's Bowery photography, which eliminates the link to portrait, to self-images and all this. Well, that's it for now.
May I take your notion inclusion and being inclusive and turn it into a question I had in mind when preparing this talk tonight, and this has something to do with the sheer fact that the two artists we are talking to have worked and still work in the realm of art and the art market, and then they both leave in very different ways, using different strategies. They leave this realm and go into something else, let's say into approaching a broader public. The question I think of, let's say, the billboards in the city center of New York, or as Edmund is working with a journalist, we already heard his name, Prof. Black, and so he is bringing in some let's say, another level, another layer of approach to reality. My question is, when we talk about the documentary and art, we always talk about a minority interest. We have to be very honest about that. Art and art museums, biennales, and so on are not the concern of the crowd. It's a small crowd, let's put it like that. Although the Venice Biennale opening nights look a little bit different. But then we have the elephant in the room here, which is so many crises at the same time. Let's say the elections coming in a couple of days. In our discussion here in the chat, the word fake news is mentioned. It's another elephant in the room. And then we have the health crisis right now going on globally. How can and this is a question to the two artists. How can you relate what you are doing in your personal artistic work to a broader audience than just, let's say, in the realm of a photo book or the gallery space? Because I think this is what I heard in your both your replies. It's important to do so. And please just jump in. I think we can manage this.
Well, maybe to be a little bit combative, I'd like to raise my eyebrows a little bit at what Edmund said about, I mean, in effect, he was putting me aside as somebody who doesn't fit his criteria of how to reach people. And I think that's fair. That is an excess of partisanship. But the fact is that that excess of partisanship is not always, and this relates precisely to your question about the tagging of photography as art immediately labels us as of a minority interest, which is kind of what I was trying to imply before. And of course, we know that and have known it. It was a hard-fought characterization of photography as art, the first century, perhaps, or close to it. But we have no choice but to give it up. Of course, looking back to my own, this is so absurd, work of the 60s, I asked myself, aren't people going to consider you a propagandist? And I had to say, well, fine. that's fine. And I will not sign or date these works. So I'm reminded that I'm making these as agitational works. And yet these works, which were of no interest at all to the art world, nor would I have shown them. And I'm talking about the anti-war photo montages. This is a long tradition in photography and art, is the creation of images that conflate different realities in order to present another one. I mean, collage immediately became a form for showing something not showable and for pointing to holes in ideology. But there's no question that they were always, at least the ones we know of, immediately designed to raise the emotional temperature and to try to activate people. So then I'm getting to my point, which is that you don't speak across a divide, you speak to your own people, or to people who would like to be your people, that is, sympathetic souls. And we always like to think that our job is to persuade people, and sometimes it is, and those are usually the most straightforward photojournalistic images of people in the third world who have been killed or starved by things that they were not in control of. That is the image of the perfect victim. The little boy drowned and so on, or starving people, but that is the unusual event, and that is presumably emanating. It's hard to argue with the objectivity of death, but that's not where I traffic elsewhere. But people working, one of the legacies of modernism, particularly in the United States, which was terrified of political engagement through the 50s and well past the end of the Cold War in 1989, is that modernism had to set up an absolute boundary between political speech and aesthetic address. But it's been my job to violate that space and to insist that if we had to choose, A, we needed to dismantle modernism, but second, we needed to ignore it. And I will say, and this is going to sound ridiculous, but I just happened to run across some photos of exactly this. The audience is most likely to respond to those photo montages, even the old ones, are the museum staff where they're shown and the people in the photo lab. That is my direct contact with people outside my social class in relation to those works, are the ones who have no trouble understanding what they say and why they say it. And why am I going on about it? Just because I think it's really important to say that the argument that we are preaching to the choir is exactly what prevents us from understanding that you marshal your own side first. And that, for me, this is really an important thing. I think it goes along with the insistence that cell phone videos and so on emanate from within an invested community and then speak outward. And that's why I was talking earlier about that appearance of authenticity and so on. You know, where does authenticity lie? It no longer, as we know, lies in any claim to objectivity, but rather to witness. You know, I have lots of problems with this. And yet I think it's really important to acknowledge. Speak to your friends first.
Yeah, I don't have an issue with that. And I was just kind of coming back to what you say, Martha, about my comments. I'm certainly not saying that all work that claims to be activist or protest work I have a problem with that. That's not the case. And some of that work, a lot of that work is incredibly effective in its own way, but there is a risk sometimes, I think, that the people who are making work do not have enough conscience of what is going on in the minds of their potential audiences. And sometimes it's easy to make work which will be accessible to your friends, but it may not go any further. Yes, it's important to get your friends on side, but it's also important to reach out to people who are not your friends, because unless work is in some way going to be able to reach people who need to think differently, then I mean, we just have to find visual strategies for doing that. And sometimes the direct activist route may do that. And sometimes, I mean, I suppose I'm also talking from the perspective of someone who works on highly problematic subjects like terrorism, like extrajudicial detention and torture. I'm not dealing with kind of absolutely sort of current, everyday subjects which are going to be accessible and wanted to be seen by lots and lots of people. I'm dealing with quite a niche subject, often subjects which people don't really want to think about. So I suppose I'm coming at it from a particular perspective. But kind of going back to the question, I think one kind of issue here is that of complexity. And we talk about, you know, the gallery, the art audience being very small. And in some ways that's true, but in some ways the art audience can be massive. And I think in some ways you kind of work on a spectrum of you can make work that is populist, that can reach a massive audience, or you make work which is not, and you will reach a smaller audience. It doesn't really matter what gallery you show it in. It's kind of the nature of the work that you want to make. I think complexity is important because when we are interrogating issues of representation, when we are interrogating issues of different truths, when we're interrogating different narratives around subjects that we see on our screens, we are often dealing with simplicity. So to be able to reconfigure that simplicity, you have to introduce an element of complexity. Often these subjects, when you start to look at them more closely, become more complex. And I think rather than, yeah, I would hesitate, or I would I don't think that the primary place for my work necessarily is the gallery. Therefore my audience is small. I would say the problem with my audience being smaller than other artists is because the work I make is complex, and people who make complex work demand a lot from their audiences. It demands people to stop, look, think, spend time with, and that is one of the things which I think limits the reach of challenging work. I also think there is going back to what I said, but I don't see that sort of the gallery is where my work is primarily seen, or the photo book. Those are two manifestations of work which reach particular types of audience. You know, my work, I think it's important to try and formulate your work so that it can have a place in publications, it can have a place on websites, it can have a place in a number of different platforms, because the different forms that your work takes as you put it out there across different platforms reach different audiences. So negative publicity was published in one form in a broadsheet magazine. It was picked up by the biggest English language website, news website, so that reaches one particular type of audience. It can be shown in a museum, which can reach another type of audience. I think it's too simplistic to say that if your work is made in one form in an art context, in a gallery context, that is just your audience. I think there's a multiplicity of audiences, and there should be a multiplicity of forms that your work can take to try and reach different levels, different kinds, different types of audience in a number of different contexts.
If I may just quickly reply, first of all, I set you up as a straw man because it was important to highlight certain things. But there's not a thing you said that I disagree with. And I also think that the art audience is immensely larger than it was even 20 years ago. And the importance of what passes for art in the art world also has changed dramatically. And that includes a lot of embedded information, which is kind of our subject here. But I also, just speaking personally, I was just looking at an old interview of mine, one sheet of paper from an article. I don't know where it is right now, but the person was asking me, I think it was in the 80s, maybe early 90s. So have you avoided the art world? To which I said yes, and of course, no. The art audience is central and crucial, and I refuse to give it up. And in fact, what motivated my little group in San Diego was precisely the demand that we can be both inside and outside the institutions. At that point, not the commercial ones, but that moment is closed. But to take your attention for another minute, I want to say that one of the things that I learned from one of my colleagues, Fred Lonadier, was to embed in any work, if you can, usually not a single image, nevertheless, was 3 levels of address. And I don't know that he would have articulated exactly that way. Something you can get right away, something that requires a little more attention, and then something that requires a whole lot more attention. And if you look at his health and safety game, he plays it out exactly that way. And it also has different messages that, which is about worker injury. It plays out exactly in that way, in that we positioned ourselves as conceptual artists. And I would hang on to that label to this day. I don't think of myself as a photographer or a videographer or a writer, but as a conceptual artist. And it is to say, in effect, what you were saying. So thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Just two comments I would say building on from that. One is I absolutely agree with you, Martha, about not rejecting the art market and the way the art world operates. It is through having my work seen in things like, art fairs in London and Paris that I have actually ended up having exhibitions in public museums. So those two platforms go hand in hand. I also you talked at the start, we talked about Laia Abril's work, and I think her work on abortion is a really interesting example of work which is directly activist, directly protest related, but comes with an element of complexity and intelligence and material for us to re-understand, to understand this subject differently, to find out new things. That it sustains an engagement at a number of different levels, but it's absolutely directly activist and directly protest, yet it has the ability, or she has created work which has the strength to maintain a level of engagement and to actually re-represent this whole subject in a way which is extremely effective. So I think she can engage a range of different audiences through what she's done. It's a very good example of a body of work which kind of transcends the direct activist and has kind of other aspects of more kind of aesthetic art practice going on.
Well, I'd like to cue in on this link to activism. I think what's missing in our little group is the journalist. Now we are talking from the point of view of art, and the way Martha has said, I stick to the art world, but I'm not exclusively in the art world. I really had to agree strongly with it for 2 reasons. I think the concern about getting about reaching a wide audience with a message, and its contrary, that is a relative autonomy of artistic thinking, conceptualizing and production, is very much actual right now. It's a real struggle, because and mostly because no, let's start from another point of view. What you mentioned before as the small platform for the art, which is the gallery and the biennales. Well, the biennales have become very resourceful and very linked. So the circulation of art in the media is vast and very diverse. The other thing is biennales are filters of discourse. They are discourse producers. And they're not so much art producers, they are discourse producers. And as such, they have another struggle on their plate, which is legitimation, social legitimation. And they very strongly use art activism as legitimation. And so does the younger generation of artists. And that's not something I'd call conceptual art. That is this very stringent connection between art, concept, and political thinking, let's call it political thinking, has been kind of diffused into this kind of huge dispersion of the political. And I think that's extremely important for the art production today. And I wonder what a journalist would say about this. I would like to come back to the question, does art need to legitimize itself through these organs or platforms in the way it does now, for which it needs photography? Yeah. All media you have at your disposal. And what would the journalists say about photography these days?
Maybe. Thank you. Maybe this is a perfect opportunity, your remark and all your remarks actually, to bring in one of the questions we got here in the chat. And I'd like to remind our participants that it is possible to write down your questions, and I try to pick it up. So it's Liza Bernard who is, I just read the question. The real influencers are people like Kylie Jenner, who, now, please don't write right now, otherwise I cannot read the chat. So the real influencers are people like Kylie Jenner, who have over 140 million Instagram followers, and she earns over 100 million per post. I envy her. How do you think that artists can become influencers on new platforms about the important things? We as artists mostly have print runs of 2,000 books. It doesn't compare. Well, and of course it goes to all of you, and of course to you, Edmund, since you are an artist working in a very tremendous way with books.
Well, I'm not sure I want to be Kylie Jenner, but it's definitely a fair point. I mean, if there is, I mean, another example, yeah, I mean, I suppose it goes back to what I said about that kind of idea of the spectrum of popularity or not, less popular. You know, there is a trade. I mean, Grayson Perry, for example, is a British artist who makes work which is political, but he absolutely places himself in a populist context. He makes popular TV programs, he's all over the radio, he's all over television. He is a huge personality, he's a character. But I get a sense, I've kind of heard him basically say this, is that he has used his personality and his persona to reach a large public populist audience, because he feels that gives him a platform to then make work which is more political and questioning, and that's very effective. I mean, there's, you know, that is the more popular you make yourself, the bigger your audience will be, and then potentially the more problematic your work can become, because you can actually start to undermine the populism that you've created for yourself. But do people really do that? Does Grayson Perry actually have that effect, or do you become neutered by that degree of popularity? I don't know. I mean, sure, Kylie Jenner can have massive influence. Oprah Winfrey has massive influence. Is that art? Is that journalism? Is that activism? I mean, you could say what Oprah Winfrey does in some contexts is activism, and that's very powerful and very potent. But does that relate to what we're talking about in terms of art practice, in terms of visuality, in terms of making work as mere unimportant artists?
I see that Lisa actually asks me directly, how does Martha think that artists can become influencers?
Sorry, Lisa.
Well, you know, the whole question here is something that I assume you all recognize, which is that the problem that the art world, artists and the art world have been struggling with since the mid-1960s, which is how to differentiate ourselves from the mass media and from celebrity status. And of course, we have capitulated. You don't agree?
I don't think that's the problem the young ones pose.
Well, that may be true. And yet the fact is that we are talking about the celebritization of artists since then, and even sports figures. And so some artists may become Kylie Jenners, but I think Kylie Jenner is going to be in a separate category because the embeddedness of her persona is in a mass medium, whereas the embeddedness of artists is always in that minority medium that Steffen mentioned. We cannot be Kylie Jenner unless we become Kylie Jenner, at which point we have lost our audience of people who want to buy our work, which is actually ridiculous, but it still nevertheless assumes that, and as someone is quoting here, Steve Edwards, documentaries back while being confined to the prison house of art, this is from Donald Webber, and neoliberal polity. Is it possible to create a documentary of transformation, to build new institutions of dissent? Well, I always say, yes, sure, let's do it. But it really requires a lot of effort and also forces beyond our control. We will never be able to overtake TikTok or Instagram or YouTube because the conditions for participation as an influencer are, on the one hand, not necessarily known in advance, and second, often tend to lead to a firm embeddedness in highly capitalized mass media platforms other than Instagram or TikTok. So yes, of course, we can insist that documentary, such as it is, can reside outside the prison house of art and neoliberal polity, but not yet. We first need to rebuild the institutions which post-Thatcher and Reagan and the world of neoliberalism brought by them. And we are stuck still finding our main support within the organs of dissemination and publicity organized by the art world. One slight correction or note I want to point out there was a slippage between what Edmund said and what Susanne took him to be saying. He didn't say biennial, he said art fair. And I would say that this is a critical distinction because the biennial certainly is involved in, says that it's involved in discursive investigations. The art fair barely bothers.
I'm referring to Steffen's intervention.
Excuse me?
I was referring to Steffen Siegel's intervention.
Oh, I'm sorry. But Edmund, you had mentioned the art fair.
I did, yeah.
Which has supplanted the biennial as a platform for the elevation of artists.
Yes. It is interesting that art fairs are magnets for public institutional curators. They go there to see work. They go there to look at work. It's a fact.
we may take the word art fair as an opportunity to I just quote a sentence you said in the book, in the interview, Edmund, you gave for the book. I quote, "Photography is an acquisitive act. You create a piece of visual knowledge by putting something in a frame, making a choice, and saying, this is important." And I really like your word acquisitive here, because it could be understood as in terms of the marketplace as well, just to grasp something. And we have several questions here in the chat that relate to, in different ways, to capitalism. I just read one of the questions here. Does capitalism impact the representation of truth in documentary? Or another one, I think, which is, no, it's here in the chat as well. We have to divide between art that is produced for visual consumerism or art that's produced for the matter of art. So the marketplace comes in, and this is pretty obvious, but maybe we should discuss this kind of background, which is not just a background, which is actually the foundational work for what's going on here, namely consumerism. And we just talked about social media and how visual stuff there is made for the moment and not just for a little bit longer. You talked about complexity and control and embedded information. That seems to be something different. So maybe it's easy to answer the question, does capitalism impact the representation of truth in documentary, with just a very frank yes, but maybe you would like to go more into the details.
Me, Martha?
You both? Edmund.
Yes, is the straightforward answer to that. I think it's self-evident that the act of photography, the history of photography, the technology of photography is complicit, is implicit in the history of the market, of colonialism, of industrialization. It's all about acquisition. Photography is about taking. The act of the individual photographer is about taking, putting it in your frame, having it, saying it's mine, saying this is it. It's hugely individualistic and problematic as an act, as a political act. I don't think we can get away from that. Mm-hmm. I think photography is obviously hugely affected by capitalism and consumerism. It is everything about photography and its history and its technology is utterly embedded and implicit in contemporary the world. And that's its problem, but in some ways it's also its rich potential, because you can be the worm within that, which is in some way trying to worm its way out. If you're aware of that, if you can use that in some way, then perhaps you can make work which is more interesting, is questioning, is in some way trying to create new forms of seeing, which may be leading to institutions, new forms of institutions. I don't know, this is getting sort of fantasy land, but I think having that basic awareness of that problem of making work, I think is essential to how we make images, understand images, and consume images. I think it's kind of obvious.
I see that one of the questions is about fake news. Mm-hmm. But it's posed, sorry, in terms of journalism. I've often worried that, like a dog with a bone, the question of the relationship of photography to truth, that's something that all of us have, obviously. And although one regularly sees unwanted images posted as Photoshop, this is Photoshop, which things, and also deep fakes and all this stuff, though Unfortunately, we're about to enter deep fakes. Video, cell phone video has largely been exempt from that, even though the problem of contextualization and captioning applies there as well. But now with the production of deep fakes, which really exist, and the creation of characters who are not people, but AI entities, the entire basis of that instantaneous response we have to an image on a primitive level as representing something real, even as we might try to reject it. We are on uncharted territory here. I think we've all fallen back on, and I think quite rightly, on a heterogeneity of evidence to make our case. The show that I saw of Edmund in New York had many documents, for example. And multiplicity of forms of address. Journalism is moving in that direction because newspapers and journalistic entities understand that you can't just have an image and say, well, this means this or that, and you can't just have an article, but that you need to have many different hooks that capture people's attention and perhaps their assent that what's being displayed actually has resonance in the real world. In other words, the flatness of an image, which I referred to earlier, that is the absolute inarguability of a dead body. Jan Hersey, was that the little boy's name? Lying in the Mediterranean is only available for a while, and all other efforts to persuade people of, as you were saying, Edmund, things often that are invisible require a complex layering of different contexts and different forms of address. So I don't know what this has to do with capitalism, but it certainly has to do with the question of facticity and fakeness. That is, to use Susanne's word, of course, legitimation. If all messages in the public space are delegitimized, which of course is an effort of our homegrown fascists, then it's very difficult without the heat of activist involvement and masses of people, itself a problem, to actually form a consensus that the messages that they have been receiving are true. This may have, what I'm saying may have nothing to do with the questions at hand, but I think for me, they are the context in which we know how to understand things, even influencers like Kylie Jenner. I mean, it's against the backdrop of the question of voicing and voicelessness. I also want to say that the alt-right has learned to capture the art world's favorite tactic, which is irony, which has often been used to divide messages in the art world from people in the real world who generally don't understand irony and don't understand why anyone would be presenting them with an ironic message. But it has been very effectively used by the right to disable the middle class, doesn't know how to deal with ironic statements by the Proud Boys, for example, and by their own audience, which ignores ironic statements in favor of shows of force. So again, the mixed message. It organizes the young men involved in these alt-right spaces, does not translate necessarily to their followers, but when they show up and make a spectacle of force, that does. So on the one hand, they disable us, and on the other hand, they potentiate the people for whom irony is not a powerful argument or powerful means to make an argument. I feel like I'm speaking American. It's not interesting.
Well, actually, it is interesting since we somehow are influenced here in Europe by American politics anyway, so we cannot escape, and certainly not during these days and weeks. I think it's not a surprise that we more or less automatically entered the realm of politics when speaking of the documentary and all the different approaches to it. However, Andres Servigon in the chat reminds us that there's something like an history of that this notion underwent, and it came into being in terms of this kind of speaking we are using right now in the 1920s, and it referred to something like the document, and it had something like it might be an iffy way to render it, but still there was an attempt to use it for a very specific approach. And now we face a lot of let's say development. And his question is now, what are we not saying when we use the word documentary today? Or to put it differently, it could be a mask, or it could be something like a catchword that makes us think in a very specific way, but somehow distracts us from maybe important questions. Do you want to react to Andres' question? What are we not saying when we use the word documentary today?
Could I argue for 1 second with his purported historical origin of documentary, just to say, I don't feel this in any way invalidates the question, but documentary actually, by the man who basically coined the term, felt that it required a surplus of beauty in order to carry weight. And this is extremely important because it puts us smack dab in the territory of the iconographic and artistic set of references, that it's that surplus that carries, that it is not simply a bureaucratic utterance, nor is it necessary, though I would agree that it was institutionally supported. But carry on with the question, which is a reasonable question about what are we covering.
Mm-hmm.
It is a word of legitimation. It says, yes, this is a real thing that I'm doing, not just sticking these awful facts in front of you. This is a documentary. In other words, it's a complicated form of argumentation.
I was just reading a message, apropos message, where there seems to be the most important thing to get the more important messages across. And I wonder if getting the messages across is the problem, is a real problem, let's put it that way. For the motivation of making a documentary, for the motivation of making art. And I must remember very positively when Martha said, I want to talk with my friends first. And it makes me think about the subjective, the individual motivation for doing things which is not operationable, put it that way, which is not squeezed into a function right away. A function that is dictated by getting a message across to within these platforms where you count clicks, for example. So there must be a way, if you are doing documentary work, where you tend to still think about putting across something authentic and true, or whether you are doing art, and even if you're doing it with activistic motivation, there has to be a way to orient your doings through your subjective field of motivation and interest, and to construct a work accordingly. And I think this is the great thing about conceptual rigor, to cross to find the line between the subjective conditions and motivations and the analysis of the outside world.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is very essential, because otherwise we get lost, and I see it from the comments on the side. We get lost in counting clicks for the effectiveness of what we are doing. If we don't trust our own stuff, we won't have any effectiveness whatsoever in whatever channels we use. And I'm of a firm conviction concerning this. I might be a German idealist or whatever, or just an old person who thinks in categories which are not relevant anymore, but I'd like just to put this in.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Big silence.
I'd go for that.
You go with that?
Yeah.
Good.
I don't know. What are we? I don't really, to be honest, understand the question. What does documentation not do? What are we not doing? I don't understand that. No,
choices we are not doing. No, you had this thing before about the choices you make when you do a documentary. All the other things you don't choose are not documented well.
Yeah. The more I kind of reflect on what we've been talking about, the more I think we're getting sort of lost in this idea of what's art and what's documentary. I come back to two words. One is subversive and one is active. And in terms of my kind of motivation for why I'm making work and what I'm trying to do with it, I think what I'm trying to do is probably subversive. I'm trying to subvert the way things are being seen. I'm trying to subvert the absence of the way things are being talked about, the absence of what is being talked about. When it comes to being active, if I want to be an activist, I will go out and do something active. I don't see what I'm trying to do creatively, what I'm trying to do as a documentarist, as a visual journalist, as an artist. I don't see that as being my active role. I see that as trying to do something which is subversive. It's trying to use the history of seeing, use the history of photography, use the message we see on our screens to try and add to that, to change that. I come back to the idea of the worm from inside. It's a subversive thing. Whereas activism is, I will go out, I will protest, I will shout, I will go and work somewhere, I will do something that is activist for me. That is my responsibility as a citizen, to go out and do something that is activist. It's not my responsibility as an artist to do something that is activist. My responsibility is to try and change the way in which we understand the world that is represented through words and images on our screens.
I agree. It's as citizens that we are out in the street, not as artists. And I think it's really important for people to remember, just as you said it so succinctly, what we do in our capacity as artists is one thing, whether we consider it agitational or activist or recherche or whatever, speaking to others with epistemological questions about representation, we still have a responsibility, if possible, to fulfill as citizens.
Well,
acting in the world. Sorry.
Well, excuse me. I was thinking about the work of an artist who sees her work as activism, and that's the documentary artist's video work of Angela Melitopoulos, whom I have written about in this book also. And I have my problems with this kind of work. She tries to eliminate the difference you, Martha, have just talked about. And she tries to eliminate it with a kind of a media ontology. She says video and editing of video, and on the basis of very different video sources, is the ontology for affecting viewers today. And that is why she does her filming and the editing of these films on a collective platform. So what you have with video is an ontology of collectiveness, of communication, and of affecting viewer. And I have a problem also with wanting to affect the viewers. And I think that's something that is very common in journalism, because that's one of the legitimatory figures. You publish a photo that's supposed to affect people. We have had a criticism of that already through Susan Sontag and others, so that's an old topic. And I am very, very distrustful towards this dealing with affect, because it's a very paradoxically instrumentalizing, functionalizing affect, which is supposed not to be representational, which is supposed to be independent of, let's say, cultural construction. But how can you do manipulative work on affect if it is pre-representational? And there you come into, and there, I think that is a question that links documentary work these days with artistic research-based work these days, which very often claims, on the basis of activist aims, working on affect as a political system of transport, let's put it that way. I think that's a dangerous thing to do.
Yeah.
I am sorry to say that the time is running out and we have left only a couple of minutes, and maybe we can go to Michael Hinz's question, which is kind of bringing us into the future. It's a very professional question at some point, or let's say a very pragmatic one, but then maybe it is worth to try to answer this kind of interest, because it brings it makes aware that we are not just discussing something like up in the clouds, but of course it is related to circumstances of living a life, making money. I know it's Susanne von Falkenhausen just said she's not competent when it comes to this kind of question. And we have written answers as well, but Edmund, Martha, you may try and answer.
Well, I've never tried to make a living from my work. I was a teacher that now no longer, a professor that no longer is available to most practitioners, especially in the US. And also the pandemic means that our entire university system is crashing, which is a serious issue. And there are no more journalistic outlets, except that there are. The newspapers have taken over the platforms, the internet, and have employed many, many, many more photographers than they have before, and video makers. So that is one mode, but in that case, you are part of an army and working, well, it depends. You could just give them your work and they produce. The New York Times has some amazing videos. But I am the worst at predicting of anybody in the world, because I wrote an article called Post-Documentary, because documentary had crashed and because the magazines had disappeared and so on. And then documentary, of course, because of the increase in the information, the basis of the information society made photography and other digital forms absolutely crucial, but whether photojournalists will remain, but documentarians not, is another question. If we want to make the distinction that documentarians are engaged in self-assigned long-term projects, whereas photojournalists are the same as they always were, which are people who are given assignments and the product of whose work is generally controlled by the commissioning agency. So I don't know which question to answer. They go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't predict what tomorrow will bring.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. I'm not sure how photographers will fund their work. It's increasingly, it's hard to fund their work. It's hard to make, I don't make a living as a photographer anymore. I did once upon a time. The nature of my work has made that kind of impossible. I teach, I get funding through grants, I get funding through all sorts of different sources. I think that model is probably going to be the same for a while. I now risk contradicting almost everything I've said this evening. Where do I see documentary photography in 10 years' time? One thing I do see emerging in response to the mess that is going on in our world is the increase in collaborative, participatory, multidisciplinary practice, which clearly has a political and an activist intention behind it. And I think the problems of actually being able to make a living as a photographer is contributing to that growth in people seeing a purpose and a role for their creative practice. And that extends to participation and collaboration, working in groups, working with other people, being part of a collective, because that is something which is how they see their role of citizens, is actually there is where their role as creative people and as active participating citizens in their society come together. I think that is one of the few positive, optimistic things I see going on in the creative world, in the art, in creative practice at the moment. I see it with my students, I see it with fellow other kind of people who make work. There is a growing impetus to make long form, in-depth, quite subjective, participatory, collaborative work, which is because people have a belief that we need to change the world that we live in.
Nice way to conclude.
This is exactly what I'd say, and we got a thank you from Michael. So I think this is the best moment to hand over back to our host, Karen.
Yeah, great, thank you. I can't really conclude with saying, oh, I think we covered most of the questions. You opened up a wide field, but at least for me, it's been really, really interesting. So I hope you, the panelists, enjoyed the talking to each other. And I hope that all the people from the audience enjoyed listening to the discussion today. Yeah. Thank you very much. If you like to know more about Image Matters, if you like to have a closer look at the book, of course, you can visit our website. Yeah, thanks for joining, and hopefully we can continue one time. At least for me, there are some questions I'd like to go on with. Okay, so bye-bye to Berlin, London, and
Brooklyn.
London.
Ciao.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Ciao, Elena. Discussion. Elena ist mal wieder sehr positiv.
Bist du selber nicht positiv?
Doch, aber Elena ist noch positiver. Okay, let's finish.
But I've got the feeling that 90 minutes time, it's a lot for a Zoom talk, but it's not enough to cover all these questions.
No, it isn't.
I found the things we covered to be very interesting. It's interesting in part because they are a kind of intensification of the things that we've been concerned about for a very long time, despite the changing technological and financial circumstances. These questions still remain. Just say this points out the centrality of the visual image to our cultural understandings, but you already knew that.
But you don't have the feeling, Martha, that you had to talk all the same things you've been talking about ages ago. No, not really. I wouldn't say so.
It's impossible for me to know, but I think in large part, they are the same things. The circumstances have changed, but various fundamental issues ranging from platform to legitimation and to relationship to power, influence, and money. These are basic to our civilization.
But I thank you very much, Martha, because I found your thinking extremely lucid and still highly actual.
Early in the morning for me. Thank you.
Okay.
Late now, I'm not lucid anymore.
Yeah, so have a very good day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much for giving me the opportunity to
Yeah, thank you for joining. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Edmund, we did meet.
We did.
One second at the ICP, but I was embarrassed. So.
You were embarrassed. Well, I would be embarrassed.
Well, you had given a wonderful talk.
Thank you very much. Yes, we met with Susan, didn't we, as well?
Yes, and also my studio manager was David Birkin.
Who I know very well, David. Yes, yeah. No, I think what you did throughout your career has shaped this discourse. So what you said tonight is absolutely as relevant now as it was when you started making your work in the 70s. Yeah. So.
Well, that's a very